And most of the people that were benefited by this in France were gays. But sometimes brothers and sisters entered into a pax because they jointly owned property, they lived together, not in any sort of romantic way, but the legal benefits of being together were such that in a pax, in something similar to what a civil union might be here, there were tax advantages, there were other things like being able to make decisions should one of the people in this arrangement become critically ill or something like that, have power of attorney, all of those things. We don't have civil unions except for in a couple of places, and they were sort of only briefly there. But we have the functional equivalent of civil unions. We also have people who have been married and widowed and find somebody else that they want to live with. And if they get married, they're going to lose the benefits they were getting before. And so they decide not to get married. They live with each other, they love each other, they take care of each other. Chances are, although it doesn't only have to happen in the case of elderly people, chances are these people would be elderly, and so there are going to be a lot of people who have a crisis and who need their loved one there to take care of them or bring them to the hospital or make decisions, and they can't always legally do so unless the state decides to recognize the possibility of that happening. There's no reason why laws couldn't be passed saying that a heterosexual couple living in this situation could have the advantages that married couples enjoy without losing their benefits, unless this amendment is passed. This amendment says you can't do that. This amendment says you can't do anything that makes it look like it's a marriage. There's an interesting organization that's attached to the Florida legislature that has to review all bills to decide its economic impact. And it was a really weird report that they gave. But one of the things that they said was probably a negligible economic impact will be a lot more people will file for marriage certificates because elderly people who have been living together in order to save the benefits are going to have to weigh whether or not they're going to give up their benefits or be able to take care of their partner in older age. This is something that has been considered and looked into relating to this amendment. And that seems like a minor thing, perhaps. I don't think it is. But there are even more crazy things. There was a hand? Yes?
Yeah. Doesn't Florida have a constitutional right to contract, and that says, wouldn't the substantial equivalent thereof be a constitutional right?
If this is a constitutional amendment, then any statute is going to be affected by this.
No, I think my question is, and I'm not sure of it, but I think the Constitution itself speaks to the right of contract.
It speaks to the right of contract. It depends on how contract is defined. What's interesting about what you say is I lived in Israel for several years. Israel is very bizarre. And Israel is one of the things that made me into a staunch advocate of separation of church and state because separation of synagogue and state, because there is no separation there. And one of the things that prevails in Israel is you may not get married unless you get married by a licensed Orthodox rabbi, and in order to do that you have to prove all sorts of nutty, crazy things about how pure you are and how pure your mama was and all sorts of things you don't want to ask. And so there was a civil rights activist who I think she's still alive. Anyway, she created contracts. So she did her own weddings that weren't weddings. They just drew up a contract like it was a business. And you legally changed your name if you wanted to do that. And so you you were married as far as your friends were concerned. You weren't married as far as the state was concerned, but the terms of the contract were such that you had most, you couldn't get all, but most of the benefits of being married. And this was mainly a protest sort of thing. But there is an attempt to do that. But I can imagine, and I'm not a legal scholar per se, but I can imagine somebody differentiating between a purely commercial contract and a contract that tries to go beyond the merely commercial. And I think that's what would happen. The language is what allows for unintended consequences. Let us say that the average God-fearing person probably does not like the idea of same-sex marriage. They're going to vote for Amendment 2, and we are going to try to argue with them and tell them that that's not necessary, it's not good, etc. But they're still going to be thinking it's all about not allowing same-sex marriage and preserving traditional marriage. But the language, substantially the same, unions that are substantially the same as marriage, they're not going to read that. That's put in not without knowing what the unintended consequences are. That's put in knowing what some other consequences could be. It's a very well-crafted amendment for those who want it. Now, why is this a separation issue? And I've already sort of been tripping into that. To a large extent, the whole argument about traditional marriage and needing to preserve traditional marriage and same-sex marriage being such a bad thing, not for everybody, but for most people, rests on religious conviction. The organizations that are supporting Amendment 2 are mobilizing within the religious organizations. If you go to the websites, they have church mobilization packets and packets for sermons for pastors and workshops for pastors, etc. The focus is getting your church involved. Now that's evidence but not proof of the point. And we have to be very careful. This is one of the things that I'm worried about. Because in a certain sense, as long as it's not partisan politics, absolute no-no. But in a certain sense, we don't want to forbid churches to mobilize on important issues. That's how the civil rights movement got most of its marchers. But the civil rights movement was not trying to deny anybody their rights. They were trying to do the opposite. But the principle of should a church mobilize itself for a cause, as long as it's not a partisan cause, is not something we want to be against. So talking about it this way, you have to be very careful. But it's still the case that the definition, the arguments used, the intention of the people who are pushing this has very deep religious roots. It's trying to, I would argue, impose a very specific religious definition and set of religious rules in a secular setting. And this has also happened in other situations, whether it's divorce.